I'm bursting with God news. I'm walking on the air. I'm laughing at my rivals. I'm dancing my salvation. Nothing and no one is holy like God. No rock mountain like our God. Don't dare talk pretentiously. Not a word of boasting ever. For God knows what's going on. He takes the measure of everything that happens. The weapons of the strong are smashed to pieces, while the weak are infused with fresh strength. The well-fed are out begging in the streets for crust, while the hungry are getting second helpings. The barren woman has a house full of children, while the mother of many is bereft. God brings death and God brings life. He brings down to the grave and raises up. God brings poverty and God brings wealth. He lowers and he also lifts up. He puts poor people on their feet again. He rekindles burned out lives with fresh hope, restoring dignity and respect to their lives, a place in the sun, for the very structures of earth are God's. He has laid out his operations on a firm foundation. He protectively cares for his faithful friends step by step, but leaves the wicked to stumble in the dark. No one makes it in this life by sheer muscle. God's enemies will be blasted out of the sky, crashed in a heap and burned. God will set things right all over the earth. He'll give strength to his king. He'll set his anointed on top of the world. That sounds like a prayer of military victory, doesn't it? And in fact, it really is. It's in the ancient form of one. It's about 3,000 years old. And it's in that ancient form that they used for prayers of thanksgiving after military victory. And yet that's not the setting for this. This prayer is written by a woman. It was said by a woman whose womb was bare. She was living in a time and a culture where it was very, very important for women to bear sons and allow the family legacy to move on. It was so important that bigamy was accepted as a part of the culture. This is where the story gets racy about Hannah, because she was one of 2 wives. Yes, that was very accepted. Polygamy wasn't, but bigamy was. Just in case the first wife couldn't bear a son, let alone bear any kind of children, men took a second. I can't imagine such a world. I can't imagine the disgrace that it would be to feel like I couldn't live up. And yet that was Hannah's plot. She was the one whose womb was completely barren. And the message I want you to hear this morning is how God works in our nothingness. God works in our barrenness. And he wants to work in all of our barrenness if we will claim it. It was a day when the first wife, as you can imagine, was not very kind. She taunted Hannah. She made fun of her. She drove Hannah absolutely nuts. She made her angry. It was the tradition every year at the time of the Feast of the Booths, or the Feast of the Tabernacles. It was autumn about this time of year, in fact, where they would go up to Shiloh and they would offer their sacrifices of thanksgiving for the harvest that had come in. And every year, that first wife, Peninnah, would taunt Hannah. And she'd say, There must be something wrong. God must not love you because you're barren. And Hannah could take it only so long. There was a time where she went into deep depression. Ever been there? It's a dark, lonely place. Her husband came by and he said, "Don't you know that I love you? Don't you know that it's okay?" He said, "I've tried to prove that to you. I've given you double portion of the sacrifice. I want you to know." And somehow, with those words of affirmation, Hannah began to think differently in that deep, dark depression. Who is God calling you to give words of affirmation to in their barrenness? Hannah went into the temple and she began to pray. It says she prayed silently. In our culture, that's probably pretty accepted. And yet in this culture, again, it wasn't. That's a pretty remarkable thing. In the Psalms, it talks about lifting loud our voice and hear our cry aloud. Hannah's in the temple, and she's praying. She is so distraught that she can't even get the words out. All she can do is just mouth the words. She's mouthing these words, and the priest Eli comes over to her, and he says, "What's the matter with you? Are you drunk or something? Get out of here." You know, preachers are sometimes the last to realize what God's doing in the life of women praying silently. And so she looks at him and she says, "Oh no, don't count your servant as a worthless woman. I'm here begging of God to give me a child." Eli says, "Well, okay. Whatever your petition is, I hope God grants it." He walks away. She goes home with her husband. And it says that 3 months later, she was pregnant. When it came time to go the next year with this first wife, she had a son. Hannah had a son because God had intervened in her story, in her barrenness, because of her willingness to wait upon the Lord and pray silently and live in God's story. But this was not a time for Hannah to take this child and go to the temple and go, "Nah, nah, 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 nah." No. Hannah says, "I must wait." Because she had vowed to God that she would, if he would give her this son, she would take him to the temple and he would grow up in the ministry of the temple, perhaps as a Nazirite. Oh my goodness, the pain. Her husband came and said, "Yes, you may stay home. Stay with him until he's weaned." So the first 3 years, she did not go to the temple. The time came for her to take Samuel and take him to the temple. The prayer of thanksgiving that we just heard is what Hannah prayed as she left the temple. I have a 3-year-old grandson. I can't imagine leaving him. And yet the faith of Hannah that allowed herself to live in God's story. In the barrenness of her womb and the barrenness of her life, she saw and experienced God's miraculous intervention. Are you willing to claim the barrenness of your life? Some of you are sitting here and say, "Well, that could never happen to me." I mean, what's a barren womb? There's barrenness in all of our lives. It comes in a lot of different ways. There was a time in my life when it was pretty barren. Didn't look like it. It looked pretty good. Randy and I had just moved to Southern California. I had a 14-year-old, an 11-year-old, and a 6-year-old, And I will confess to you today, I was doing church. I was more concerned about my kids growing up and being good than I was the story of God in our lives and how we were living in that story. God had a wake-up call in my barrenness. You know, if you want to live life beyond biology, you have to face God. There's no other way around it. And sure enough, John was 14 years old, playing on a soccer team. I was just a simple soccer mom, standing on the sideline. After a game one day, a dad came up to me and he says, "They tell me you're one of those church ladies." I could say yes to that. That's about where it ended. But I said yes. He said, "My marriage has fallen apart, and I need to talk to somebody." We went up in the stands. Jim told me the story. He said, "My wife's going to leave this week." I said, "Jim, first of all, tell me where you are with God." I have no idea where that question came from. Jim started telling me his story, and the long story short, Jim was baptized just a few months later. I thought that was the end of the story. I thought I'd done what I was supposed to do. And yet, I was still barren. God had so much more. That was April, and in August, the mother had left. She was gone. Jim called and he said, "David's got some health problems. Would you go with us?" We went to Children's Hospital down in the other side of Los Angeles, and I stood there. I had no title. I had no education. I had no training of how to do this. I was completely barren. I didn't even have a business card that would have allowed me to be there. All I was a friend. And I stood there and listened as the doctor said to them, "Your son has a malignant brain tumor. It's in the middle of the brain, back toward the aqueduct that takes the water and drains the water out. It's inoperable. We will lose your son not to the tumor. We will lose him because the tumor will cut off that aqueduct and it will lose him to water on the brain." I wish this news was different. I stood there and held these two parents who wouldn't talk to each other and were angry at each other with vows that had been broken, asking, "What in the world, God, are you doing?" I journeyed with that family. Mom was gone. She left again. I sat up many, many nights with David. There was a time where I'd been there Friday night, all day Saturday. It was about 5 o'clock Saturday evening when Dad came, and he said, "Why don't you go on home? Go to church with your family and come back Monday morning." I knew we were in the deep throes of what was going on with David. I went home absolutely exhausted to my own family, and about 4 o'clock David called. He said, "Rhonda, you've got to come back." I said, "David, are you sure? Can it wait till morning?" He said, "No, I've got to talk." I left my family, got in the car, drove back across LA, walked into that hospital room, and he had the look of terror on his face. I said, "David, what's the matter?" He said, "Rhonda, this morning there was a chaplain that came by, and he said he told me that when I die, what's going to happen is I'm going to go down into a white tunnel, and I'm going to walk through this tunnel, and when I get to the other end of the tunnel, all of my friends and family that are in heaven will be there to take me to Jesus." I said, "David, we've talked about death. You know how sick you are. I have no idea where this guy got this idea about this tunnel. Maybe he knows something about Scripture. I don't know. But I have no idea. But what's the problem here?" David says, "Rhonda, I have no friends and family in heaven. There is no one to take me to Jesus. What will I do?" the barrenness of the moment. I took David's hand and I said, David, we've talked about the fact that Jesus is right here. And I don't know where that guy got that idea, but I do know this, is that Jesus is right here, right now. And he will be right there, and he will go with you all the way. And you will never, ever be alone. It was a few weeks later. Again, I'd driven across LA, got in the elevator, went up to the floor. As the elevator doors opened, there was this sharp-looking neurosurgeon standing there waiting for me. She said, Rhonda, we've got to talk. I braced myself for the worst. We went in this little side room, and she said, I don't know what to say. But we did an MRI on David this morning, and that tumor is gone. I can't explain it. Friends, not all of our stories in our barrenness will end up like David's. I'm not here to preach, just do this, and this is the way it'll turn out. But I'm here to say that if we claim our barrenness, we have the opportunity to see what God wants to do in our world and what he can do in our world. And there is no other story in which we get to see God working like this. I went to church that night. It was a Wednesday. I remember it very, very well. This was almost 20 years ago. Women didn't do things in churches like they do today in some places. But I went into this little church where I was never allowed to speak a word. And they were ranting through the prayer list. Pray for brother so-and-so, he's got the cold, and and da-da-da. And they said, and pray for David Rowland. And I said, wait, you've got to hear. God has healed David. And there wasn't a person in that crowd that cared whether I was a woman or a man or a minister or a pew warmer. Because it's about God's story. It's not about who we are. Are we willing to accept the barrenness and claim it and allow ourselves to live in God's story so we can see him working? Are we willing to accept our barrenness and our emptiness and take it to him in silence? And quit asking, why is this happening to me? But rather, what is God doing here? I come to you as the wife of your president. And I come to you to say, claim your barrenness. And look and see what God is doing as we live in his story. We're going to sing a couple of more songs, and at the end of that song, my son is going to come and lead the closing prayer. The Lowry family loves Lipscomb University because we have a front row seat to see what God's going to do. Will you join us as we say, like Joshua said when he was leading the Israelite children, as for me and our house, we will serve the Lord.